Hey gamers! I'm that weird feeling of satisfaction and sadness you get after saving all of your items the entire game and then watching the credits roll having used none of them. It's me, Jason.
Like all the sad trauma in your past, I'm one of those encounters you just can't run away from. Casey.
Hi, when you encounter me, you have to choose gold or experience, never both. It's Aidan.
And I'm that battle track that slapped the first 50 times you heard it, but now it's starting to get a little annoying. It's me, Patrick. Welcome to RPGaymer Season 3, Episode 11, a podcast about encounters.
Only a little annoying, Patrick? Not full on annoying? Okay.
Well, that's like the 100th time.
I thought you were going to say you were Chrono Cross.
Zing! Oh man.
Casey just left the chat.
Yeah, Casey's gone.
Exit. Goodbye.
Gamers, we are here to talk about one of the things that makes games, and that is all of the different ways that encounters can be encountered, because there's no better way to describe that. But before we actually get into the bulk of our topic, you may have noticed that we have another guest this season, and this time we have the author, Aidan Moher, is here. Welcome, Aidan.
Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for having me, guys. This is awesome. I love talking about video games and RPGs, so it's a pleasure.
You love talking about it so much that you actually write a ton about these topics, right?
I do. Yes, sort of fell backwards into that a few years ago after being a lifelong fan of the genre. I wrote a piece for Kotaku in 2019, I think, and it was about the kind of intersection and the inspiration that Japanese RPGs, like Golden Age Japanese RPGs, sort of gave to a new generation of younger science fiction and fantasy authors, and how those authors, so I spoke to people like Tamsin Muir, who wrote Gideon the Ninth. I spoke to Scott Lynch and a whole bunch of other people about how they were as inspired by people like Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yuji Horii, as they were, Ursula Le Guin or Tolkien, and from there, people kind of resonated with that, and looking at the crossover culture between, gaming, Japanese RPGs, books, but also gaming and parenting and storytelling across mediums. I found sort of a niche as a writer there, and I ran a blog for a long time about science fiction fantasy books and wrote sparingly about video games because I didn't want to make a living writing about video games. I just wanted to enjoy them, but I've had a lot of fun writing about them now. So much fun that I wrote a book last year called Fight Magic Items, which I think we will probably talk about.
I was going to point out one thing. I think it's so funny because it's so right. Like, the more you work in the gaming industry, and I'm sure Casey and Jason can also very much attest to this, the less fun video games sometimes feel.
Yeah,
100%.
That can kind of sap your joy sometimes, but sometimes it can invigorate it too.
Very inversely related sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say I specifically avoid reviewing games because that's what happened with books for me. Is I ran a blog for 7 or 8 years, reviewed a lot of books, and it changed the way I read books. It changed the way I chose the books I wanted to read. It changed the way I engaged with them, and at a point it just became not fun anymore. And so I've been enjoying not having to be a critic anymore.
Just a bunch of guys being dudes having fun.
That's right, like Final Fantasy 15. Right?
There you go. Yeah,
basically, I mean that's basically the four of us right now. Let's talk about your book. We have all read it, and I know we all talked before you were on here, and we definitely enjoyed it. Especially, I know for all three of us, it was kind of like a retelling of our childhood in a way. But why don't you explain to our viewers just the gist of the book? Give them a little synopsis.
Yeah, so it's called Fight Magic Items: The History of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the Rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. And very specifically, I wanted to tell the story of Japanese RPGs and what makes them special. And so, I was there, not from the very beginning. I was too young really to be there when the first Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games were coming out in the West. I'm 39, but I was there for the Super Nintendo era. And so I looked at that and I thought a lot about that Kotaku piece I was talking about earlier, and how special these games are to people in the same way that film or books or music really helps shape who we are. And so I looked at that as sort of an inspiration for how to frame the narratives of these games, not just looking at them as technical pieces and telling a technical history, not just regurgitating a bunch of Wikipedia articles, but looking at these video games that have like changed people's lives, have changed the genre, but also the people who made them and play them, looking at what it was that inspired Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yuji Horii, or Reiko Kodama to create the games that they did, and then looking at the people who were inspired by those in turn and are now making sort of modern games inspired by Phantasy Star, Final Fantasy. And so it has a very personal touch to it. I pitched it when I first pitched it. It always said the title Fight Magic Items. But the very first subtitle was A Personal History of Japanese RPGs. And that was an angle that was, hard to find sometimes, mixing sort of memoir with recorded and reported history. But I was really, really gratified with the way it came out. I had a very strong and passionate editorial team that helped me find that. And that's been the number one source of positive feedback, is people read it and like you're saying, it feels like a trip down memory lane, or people have described it feels like sitting at, a bar with some beers across from your friend talking about your favorite games when you were teenagers. Or somebody else in a review said it was like it was like the memories I never got a chance to make because all my friends loved fighting games and I never got to play the RPGs with them that I loved. And so, I really wanted that personal touch that made people feel connected to the games. And so that, I brought in a lot of developer interviews. I brought in a lot of, people close to the games industry, currently working journalists, writers, to talk about games as well and really show and spill the beans on why these games are so important. And so but just like the subtitle says, it starts with these two series, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. And as it goes along, it follows those series to modern day, and then touches in and looks at other games, other series, other events that are happening over the course of this history and how they were impacted by Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, or inspired by those games, or how in turn they shifted the direction of the genre, and Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, were maybe following then in new directions. And so the story always comes back to these two creative teams that created Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and then Phantasy Star as well. Bit of a lighter touch on Phantasy Star than the other two.
I was happy that it was there. And I think the thing that drew me most to the book immediately was the Phantasy Star inspired cover. Yeah. Because it gives me very Alice from Phantasy Star. Yeah, I totally see that and love that. Let's take some time and ask you a few questions though about the book. Since we read it, I think this is a really good way to just kind of hear your inside thoughts. And I think our listeners, just knowing our fan base, would probably really love to pick up this novel as well. Casey, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, totally. So, Aidan, I really appreciated you ending the book talking about Fantasian, because I don't think many people have played that, and I think they released it in 2 parts, and I beat the first part, and it's actually one of the first. I wrote a personal piece about it on my own website before I really started diving into gaming journalism, and it's kind of what prompted me to sort of look in that direction, but. Yeah. So I just wanted to first off say I was happy to see that included in there, because it's a really incredible game. Where do you think JRPGs are going to be? How are they going to be evolving in the next decade or so?
Fantasian was such a perfect game to end the book with, because it's very reflective of it's very much a personal project where Sakaguchi, Hironobu Sakaguchi, who created Final Fantasy and Fantasian, looks back at the games he created, the genre he helped create and define, and look at how, along the ways, what did he do that was right, and what did he do that was, could have been done better. And that's one of, Fantasian's one of the games I want to talk about later in this episode, because he plays with the way that, combat encounters happen. And so I think Japanese RPGs have evolved so much. They started as these sort of strange, adaptations of Western PC RPGs. The way that sort of the AAA game space is going, I think we're seeing all AAA games becoming the same game. They're all third person character
open
action
world,
games, open
very
world,
dark,
quests, dark, very dark. Light stat based RPG systems, right? God of War, Horizon, Final Fantasy 16, all of these games are very similar. But so I feel like the AAA space is going to continue to converge like that. I'm very, very curious to see what Dragon Quest does with Dragon Quest 12, because it's traditionally been a very conservative game, like Dragon
Right,
Quest
11 stayed as the whole thing, right? So it's weird that they have their staple series and kind of like their experimental series. So I'm with you. I really hope Dragon Quest stays
curious.
in its niche.
Yeah, they tried. Remember Dragon Quest 9? They tried to make it an action RPG, and there's a lot of backlash. So I see the AAA space sort of continuing to converge, right? Where like I don't feel like Japanese RPG is like a binary label, and it shouldn't be something as a Japanese RPG or it's not. Like I think that it's a series of inspirations, it's a vibe, it's a thing that, you know, modern games draw on as an inspiration, at least in the AAA space. But on the flip side, we're seeing so much success with indie studios, small developers in like, you know, the crowdfunding space. And I think that's where we're going to continue to see more like, you know, traditional turn-based Japanese RPGs that like are built in the mold of like the golden age games and the Super
Sea of Stars coming out in 2 months is like the Chrono Trigger, you know, like inspired game. And I think, you know, people are super looking forward to that because like you said, it's harkening back to what we already know we love. So there's not really some like crazy I have to deliver something so unique. It's more I have to deliver something reminiscent, and I feel like those are two completely different beasts.
Well, I can ask a question that is completely the opposite of that, because mine is going to go to the beginning of the book, and I have a degree in history, but not video game history. But at this point, I probably could. But I also base a lot of my like judgments on games on the relation to like D&D and where it starts, Dungeons and Dragons for the uninitiated. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad that you referenced it with Wizardry, Ultima, those old games, which were definitely before my time, but also getting back to play them and respecting the genre from where it came from and where it started. So I wanted to see if you had like a similar vibe for me growing up, where I kind of was given video games, especially RPGs, in the form of the first Final Fantasy and the first Dragon Quest on NES. Around the exact same time, I also played Dungeons and Dragons. So I made the connections, and I could see like, okay, this is really similar, how you level up, how you grind, how you get weapons, so on and so forth. But like, I think I started to steer towards loving games more, and I think it was because of just the fantasy element I didn't have to think of. So it was just, it was already there on like on my screen. So I guess my question for you is, did you feel something similar with how you kind of developed your liking for those systems in games? Was it based on your liking of D&D? Did it come from learning Final Fantasy first and then harkening back and thinking, oh, this is cool, and then you got more into it? Like, how did you kind of develop that sort of I don't know, scholarly approach to games like that? Yeah.
So when I first, like the very first like RPG or Japanese RPG I played was Final Fantasy Legend 2 on the Game Boy, which was like it was a Kawazu game. Kawazu is one of the original like very early on Square employees who's known for making sort of irritating, you know,
weirdly difficult games or something.
Strange. Yeah, you guys, I mean, on your Final Fantasy episode, you guys were going on and on about Final Fantasy 2, and he did the battle like systems and stuff in that. Anyway, so it's like it's a really not a good first RPG, and I played it on my friend's cousin's Game Boy, and I was like, I'll go back. I just want to play Ninja Turtles or Super Mario Bros. 2. And so like I wasn't drawn in by the mechanics early on. That wasn't something that appealed to me. I was into stuff like platformers. I played a lot of Tetris. I grew up in a small community on a small island, and so I was also outdoors adventuring a lot as well. And so like I think, you know, I was looking for something different when I was playing games. My real gateway to like gaming in a fantasy space though was Magic the Gathering, even before Dungeons and Dragons. And that's sort of like when I was a kid, I also didn't like fantasy like until grade 6, end of grade 6, start of grade 7, when I discovered Tolkien. And so I liked Magic the Gathering. I thought fantasy was sort of like lame. I liked science fiction a lot, and RPGs weren't really giving science fiction-y vibes. So I finally discovered fantasy and enjoyed that. And then it was, like Final Fantasy VI that my babysitter brought over one night, and he put my little brothers to bed, and we stayed up late playing it, and I just like, that was it for me. Maybe it was a steampunky vibe.
That man
like,
is a saint.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Changed my life, like quite literally. And I remember like escaping into the mines, and the first time I was just watching him, but the first time he stepped on the first save spot, and like the screen flashes blue, and there's like this warm sound, like ding sound. And I was like, oh, this is it. Like, this is
this is the moment.
I get it. So like,
yeah.
And like what drew me though was the narrative aspect of it, because I was like, oh, this is like this is like a fantasy book. Cause I was like knee deep into Tolkien and Terry Brooks at that point. And I was like, this is a fantasy book that I can play. Yeah. It was not long after that me and my friends got into stuff like, Magic the Gathering did lead us to Dungeons and Dragons. And so, like it was all through that period that we were discovering, RPGs, we were discovering Magic the Gathering, we were discovering Dungeons and Dragons and all of that all at the same point. And so, yeah, like I think the systems, it wasn't necessarily the systems and like the gameplay that was reminiscent or drew me in. It was the story, it was the narrative stuff that I just like, I was like, how does this exist? Like I get to play the game, I get to be in the story, I get to be, an active participant in the narrative.
Nice.
Which of course Dungeons and Dragons is great at too, and that and I love that about Dungeons and Dragons.
That's the name of the game. Yeah,
exactly.
All right,
Patrick,
I'll wrap up our little book discussion. So Casey asked something about the end of the book, and Jason asked something about the beginning of the book.
This was not planned beforehand, I swear.
No, it was not, but it worked out perfectly. I'm gonna throw something in about the middle. You have a ton of little vignettes of different games that pop up in your discussion through the history, and they might be something that is going on with the time period that you're talking about, or it might be something that harkens to a system that was implemented that you're talking about. What I want to know is, what was the one game that you wish you could have spent more time on that you didn't get to in this novel?
Oh, good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give you a two-part answer. The first one is that I wasn't planning on writing as much as I did about Phantasy Star, because I didn't have a Genesis, I didn't have a Master System growing up. So I it's a bit of a, I've played a fair bit of Phantasy Star 4, but it was one that I had to do a bunch of research on. I was like, I know this is important, I need to include it. But as I got into the book, I was like, oh, I don't just need to include this, I need to tell the story of how this series was created and the people who created it. And so that was one that I was like, okay, I need to make room for it. There were so many others that I would have loved to have had more room for. I pitched the book at 70,000 words. I delivered it at 120. It published at 110. So, I was way over on word count, as it was. Wow. I crammed as much as I could in there before my publisher would get mad. The one that I look at now, and I look at the book, and I could say, the Trails of series, which I think is interesting and obviously has a strong niche audience. And I write about Trails in there, but I don't have a lot of its history because I don't think it necessarily intersects with Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest in a way that fit the narrative shape of the book. Not to say that they're not important and they haven't, had an impact on the genre or fandom of the genre. I could have written more about Breath of Fire. I could have written the whole book about Chrono Trigger. I could have just, the whole 16-bit era could have just been Chrono Trigger. But I think the one series and the one game that I feel like if I wrote the book again in 10 years, the game series that I that would need to be in there that isn't in there now, it's more of the Trails in the Sky and Trails of Cold Steel games.
That's a great answer. Just because the games are so different than the rest of the series that you mentioned, where they're the most connect. That is anime the world, or the game, you know what I mean? They're just all so much lore that goes into them, and they're so connected. And
I write I write a fair bit about Suikoden and Grandia, and I feel like the Trails games are the modern, I guess they're not really that modern anymore, but sort of the modern equivalent, or the heir apparent to Grandia and Suikoden. And I feel like it's having this upswell of support and a growing fan base. And I feel like in 10 years, it's going to be okay, that's a game that you can't write a book about the history of this genre without, really going into detail about Trails.
Well, I think that was good. I think that was a good little snippet of your thought process and some of the things that you mentioned in your book. We obviously don't want to spoil everything for our listeners, because I think anyone who listens to us would get great joy from reading it. But thank you for sharing all of that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I always like talking about it. It's fun.
Yeah.
So a reminder, we're talking about encounters today, all things encounters, how we love them, hate them, and everything in between. And I'm not gonna lie, encounters aren't really why I got into RPGs. I think, like you, Aidan, it was a story. I think it's good.
Same.
And for the most part, I did kind of feel oof, sometimes encounters are a little rough. They're not always the most fun. And that's kind of where I wanted to start. So like, how do we generally feel? What's the vibe for this? When we hear like encounters, are we like yes, or are we like, dear God, please get away from me? What do we think?
I think basically what my intro was, where I have to listen to the same goddamn song for the thousandth time, and I love it when games switch up their battle musics, because that is something for me. It's like, okay, I can go 10 more hours of this game.
It's the refresh you didn't know you needed.
It really is. Thank you, Etrian Odyssey.
Aidan, you mentioned in your book something about how playing video games and like hearing the battle music was really special, like when we were kids, because we didn't have YouTube then and we couldn't like go and listen. And so like that's something that I enjoyed about Random Encounters, because I just love video game music. Special shout out to Man with a Machine Gun from Final Fantasy VIII.
That's a great song.
Incredible.
So good. But yeah, overall I think as a kid I love them. Now, unless the encounter has like a specific almost like strategic battle system, I'm a little less inclined to enjoy them overall.
Like, it's funny you bring that up, because just before we started recording, I was watching there's like a new 18-minute preview of Final Fantasy 16, and it's like dungeon crawling, and it's just, you know, Clive going through a mazy dungeon, but like, you know, you open the door and then there's a big open room and he fights some bad guys and then he defeats them and he moves on to the next room and there's some bad guys, and I was like, like, this is really
it's one of these
heavy.
games.
Like, and I like literally out loud to myself, I was like, like, you know, I just don't really care for encounters. I don't like, that's not why I play RPGs. That's not why I play Japanese RPGs, which is silly because like they've been baked into the experience from the beginning. But for me, it's like, you know, generally I can't get through them fast enough. Like I'm playing Trails in the Sky FC right now on my Vita, the Vita version with the English translation. It has a fast forward on it, and it has auto battle. So I just jam the fast forward button on the easiest combat setting, because you know, the draw as a character in the world is in the adventure to me. You know,
it's funny that you say that about Final Fantasy, because if we look back, since it is like one of the earliest examples that we have of like how encounters are set up, and you think over the course of 16 mainline games and all of the side stories that it would change drastically, but if you like what you just described, and you're like in this big open cave and you just basically go from encounter to encounter, is literally just the same thing as Final Fantasy 1. Like it's not much of a clear evolution. It's just how the combat is handled, not the encounter itself, but like combat's different, encounter it's still the same.
But that, like, it does make sense though, because I mean, if we're basing all this on again, to your book's credit for bringing it up to D&D wizardry, the foundation of these games, like what else is an RPG? Like that is kind of where it comes from. But I think we have evolved, thank God, from like a gaming society, from the whole idea of the challenge is fighting the vampire.
D&D is interesting because, like, you know, I've listened to and started a lot of actual play podcasts for D&D, and I always burn out really quick on the ones that are really mechanics and like combat focused, when it's just dungeon crawling and fighting. Like, I really like the narrative and character driven ones where most of the role playing is just, you know, them in town trying to figure out how to, you know, whatever, you know, get across town so they can pick up their fourth member or whatever. It's like, you know, I think that we've seen a lot of games that have played around with the concept of like how to make combat important, but not overwhelming.
To your point, I think there's a general consensus across like D&D players that like, oh, I don't want to do a combat heavy thing because it's the base. It's like there's stats and you run it, but I think it takes more challenge for a DM and then like a game developer to get a good story, to bring in like Undertale, like a game that really takes the idea of that and makes it feel different. Yeah, you're still combat, but it's different. Like it's a different approach to it, and I think that's the harder thing to do. Yeah,
and I think like the emotional stakes are increased if you're fighting fewer battles, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
You know, like if you're fighting constantly, it kind of like, you know,
it's not the same fodder enemy over and over again.
Are the Dynasty Warrior games like the most exciting games in the world because you're fighting 7 billion enemies? Like,
it's the best RPG
right?
ever.
Like, and so I do think, like, you know, games that are able to figure out how to make the emotional stakes of combat rewarding are important. You know, we brought up Fantasian earlier. It has its like dimension.
I don't know how to say
system.
it either.
I don't know how to say it. But basically, and this was like I said, like Hironobu Sakaguchi, like thinking about like how do we change this? Like how do we evolve this? And he created the system where when you're in a dungeon, you can skip all the combat and say, like, so, because he's like, combat gets in the way of exploration, right? You don't want to go off the beaten path to find a chest with a potion in it if you're going to fight three combat encounters along the way. Use 2 potions just to get there. And so you can save up all the battles, and then you can fight like this huge mass of enemies at your leisure afterwards. And so he recognized that some people want to just play traditionally, fight the battles along the way. Others just want to explore and compartmentalize like the combat aspect and the narrative aspect of RPGs. And I thought that was interesting as well. Like, is it my favorite way to do it? No, not necessarily. But I thought it was like interesting to see somebody who was there at the very beginning being like, hey, 30 years later, I can do this. I can do better.
Yeah.
I also like with that system in Fantasian that the battlefield gets peppered with power-ups that allow you to do more damage and to skip enemy turns, so it would go by significantly faster than it would have had you stopped for each of those encounters on your way throughout the dungeon. Yeah. And I think it's a really great evolution of where we started.
It's hard to separate like combat and encounters, but I think like encounters as well can feel less tedious if you're rewarded for fighting smarter, if it's faster. Like, there's a lot of combat systems where like you get into combat and it's like, okay, another one, and then you have to like jump through a bunch of hoops just to like I think of Final Fantasy 13. It's like you get into another battle and you go through the same steps to like break your enemy and do a bunch of damage, and like it just the grind just to
it's
get to the point.
Worst game ever.
It's not good. So like I think if you want to have a lot of encounters, they have to be really fast and reward the player in in a different way. If you want something that's more intricate, you need to make sure that your encounters are like more thoughtfully spread out and placed out. And that's where I think something like Cosmic Star Heroine does a really good job. Chrono Trigger's the best at it, right? Because it paces out its encounters in a way that like never feels overwhelming, but gives you the resources that you need, and everyone tells a different story. Every encounter starts in a different way. The monsters jump out in a different way.
Or they're like rolling one on a ball and kicking them like a soccer ball and stuff like
so
that.
There's narrative attached to it. It's not just another random battle. How many, by the end of Persona 5, like you've fought so many battles and it's all the same. You just switch into weaknesses and, getting your one mores and knocking down. And it just like, it gets to a point where like, what am I doing here?
This?
If the combat, if those encounters aren't training you to beat a boss, like, or they aren't rewarding you for feeling smart because you managed to get through it quickly, like cut them down. Make sure that
there are some games though that I really do feel like get us into this notion of evolution over the series on encounters though. Like what comes to my mind first is the Wild Arms series, especially for 2, 3, and Alter Code F, where those are PS2 late PS1 games, but you saw the encounter gauge where they literally put in a gauge to respect the player's time, where if you didn't want to battle, you could cancel the battle before it started. And that was something that I always really appreciated, because I feel like the designers really got it.
They respected your time.
They super respected their time. Or even like, I'm not the biggest Legends of Dragoon fan, but you saw some things letting you know when an encounter was coming, as opposed to just spontaneously popping up. So you'd have like the color change of the cursor. So like I think there are little things that developers are doing, but what frustrates me is when we get to the current generation and how encounters are handled, in that when we're seeing these remasters of some of these older games, it's so frustrating that they know that old games were so tedious that they just give you the option to either max damage, no encounters, or tons of experience. And for me, like, I like experiencing these older games, but like you were saying, how can we make it more impressionable or meaningful for these encounters?
I think that's a good point, Patrick. I'm sorry. That's a good point, Patrick. I think like in that idea, like going back to the older times, like I just don't think that development of games had gotten to the point where you had meaningful encounters. So when you go back to a friend of mine replayed Final Fantasy 9, and I think there's an option where you could just be level 99 or something like that. Like you could start really high, and I'm just like, oh, interesting, like why would you do that? And then I'm watching him play it and I'm like, I get why you would do that because there's no reason. Like I'm there for the story, and
it's like story mode. It's like playing a CRPG on story mode now, where like you didn't have that option back then. So like people who just want to see the story, they don't care about combat.
They don't care about combat. And like I mean, I love 9. It's like,
but that's also what
one.
YouTube is for, right? Like
right, exactly. Let's play it. And I love 9, and I will love it forever. But when I look back, I'm like, the combat was fine, but like I think I remember everything else more. Like I remember the characters, I remember the story, I remember the music. Like when I think of the combat, I'm like, yeah, I had a cool fight song, and like I don't really care about
I don't even think I remember
everything else
song.
in it. Oh, I just when you were doing your thing in my mind, I'm like playing like it's going in my head. But yeah, I think that's kind of where it comes from.
Well, I think I want to get back to Wild Arms in a second, but I think one of the interesting series to look at, and I write about that. I wrote just before I published my book, I wrote a big long history of Chrono Trigger called Timeless, which you can find online. And in there, I examine how. No, this was a separate piece. This is a different piece I wrote about how Chrono Cross wastes Chrono Trigger's greatest gift, which is New Game Plus. And I play Chrono Trigger all the time. I recently played through Chrono Cross using New Game Plus, using one of my old teenage save files. So I was like had 99 stars or whatever, and I played through it, and I was like, man, like this game isn't very satisfying to play through with New Game Plus, because the story is just what it is, right? It's baffling and doesn't make sense, and it's super pretentious. And when that's all you're focused on, like you get the audio visual stuff, which is obviously great in Chrono Cross, but like Chrono Cross doesn't hold up very well as like a visual novel. It doesn't hold up very well as an adventure game, which is essentially what a New Game Plus run is when you just plow through combat, right? Like you can run from every battle in that game. Like if you're on New Game Plus, like you don't have to fight anything except bosses. Chrono Trigger
for the bosses.
Yeah. Chrono Trigger, on the other hand, you have New Game Plus, and I have like high level characters on a New Game Plus file, and like the experience of playing it the first time and playing it the second time are like they're almost different games. The first time is a fairly traditional RPG because you're taking time to fight combat, you're taking time to learn your spells, you have to use weaker spells in your repertoire. By the time you hit New Game Plus, so it's almost just like an adventure game, like an old school adventure game where it's a world that you're exploring, you're going on quests, you're speaking to people, you're doing the plot, but combat is a non-factor. You never really think about it. So it plays like not like a point and click adventure, but like along those lines, almost something like
Baldur's
Grim
Gate.
Fandango, like not even Baldur's Gate, but like something where it's like very like about just exploration and combat, and that's really satisfying. And Chrono Trigger holds up so well without combat, whereas Chrono Cross is like, oh, I'm just here for Kato's weird fever dream, and that's not very satisfying. And so some games I do think are better with combat because Chrono Cross's combat is so interesting, and when you're pushed to that limit and your brain has to switch gears in Chrono Cross, and you're focusing on its fairly complex combat system, its tough bosses, then by the time you're back to the story, you're like, your brain needs a break from all of that. And then once you've read through some of Kato's story, you're like, okay, like please get me back to the combat. And so it's just interesting to see how removing combat from some of these games changes the experience in a positive and a negative way as well.
Okay, everyone, we have discussed a lot, but we're going to take a quick break, grab some more water, get ready. We're going to be right back at you.
And we're back from break, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about RPGs, but encounters aren't exclusive for just RPGs. Like you get encounters in pretty much any kind of game you play. So I want to talk about this notion of how do encounters look like when we're playing these regular adventure games, whether that's your Marios or your action games like Devil May Cry, God of War, or even Resident Evil, because there is some intentionality that comes into how your monster layout is set up, right? It's not like it's just monsters go.
Me first. So I think I love talking about design and like aspect of games like this. So I think with RPGs, you tend to get we'll loosely say open world idea, but like you don't always know the path the player is going. But in a game like the older Legends of Zelda, I guess Legends of Zelda. In those games,
Legends of Zeldas.
Legends of Zeldas. Yes, leave this in.
Legends of Zeldas.
You will know, like the developers know, Link is coming down this path, and he will encounter this boss. Later on, like it's a little more freeform. Like Tears of the Kingdom blows us out of the water, but like you definitely know where they're going, so you can develop a game with that in mind. So you know what will happen. He'll have these. This is how you beat the boss.
But hang on, because I want to get you on that real quick.
Yeah,
I would say that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have less encounter design than any of the other Legends of Zeldas, where when you walk into a room for any of the Legends of Zeldas earlier, they think about like, oh, we're gonna mix and match these monsters with each other. But like Breath of the Wild is very like, because it's so open, you can't really craft an experience. Does that make sense?
That's I agree with you. Like that's what I'm saying. So with these older ones, the developers will know, like they can build the game knowing the player will experience this thing. Whereas in an RPG or like Tears of the Kingdom, like they won't know what you're going to go in with. So like let's just say, for example, you don't yet have a bow. So like if you don't have a bow in a boss fight, you can create a very unique experience where you have to get creative without using a bow. But with an RPG, you might be level, I don't know, freaking 50 when you're supposed to be like 30, and you can just wail on a boss. In Tears of the Kingdom, for that same experience, you can have a bow. So like, it could be very different. Like, how do you make it differently? So I think that's the unique aspect outside of RPGs with encounters, is that if it's done really well, you get creative and unique experiences that exemplify the gameplay. And to not talk forever, I'll end it on God of War 2018. One of my favorite games does it so well, where it just develops the player's skills as you go through the game. And like it makes you play it in a certain way where you don't just again wail on the same thing over and over. You're not grinding. You're doing something unique the developers intended you to do. I
just beat God of War 2018 for the first time a couple of months ago. And I think encounter design in that is fabulous. It is a little like, you walk into the room and there's going to be an encounter. It's sort of like compartmentalized across, there's exploration and combat encounters, but they do it in a way that feels sort of natural in the world. And I think that Final Fantasy 16 calling on God of War 2018 is a good sign that, even if the changes in the way that they're like, laying out and changing the combat, I do hope that they are taking cues on how God of War designs the balance of narrative and combat encounters, and how combat encounters, the way that they happen, the frequency that they happen, ties into sort of the narrative that it's telling as well, right? You have a kid that you're trying to protect, and so there are times when Atreus is like heavily involved in those encounters. There's times when the encounter happens because of an action that he takes that's out of the player's control, or there's times where you're basically trying to get him back, and that kind of stuff is really interesting when you're drawing narrative into combat encounters, which I think is really good. There's a good as well, just touching on what you're saying about Tears of the Kingdom, I find the Demon Souls, the Elden Ring games really interesting, and H Bomber guy has a good video on Dark Souls 2. I think it's in his Dark Souls 2 video, where he talks about how like Dark Souls, everybody loves its like really labyrinthine and interconnected world design, right? But he talks about how that kind of compromises Miyazaki's ability to craft those really whittled down combat experiences, because players can come at the combat from many different directions, and sometimes you have to walk through and then backtrack, and so you have this really like handcrafted combat experience for if you're coming face on, but on the return village, the archers are in a place that makes them harder or more annoying to deal with, or way easier to deal with. So the kind of seams in the game design start to show because of the interconnectedness and the reduced ability to really handcraft exactly how the player is going to be in that situation when the encounter happens.
Just trying to compare like a turn-based RPG encounter system to something else, it's just like apples and oranges, but I really like it when a game offers up more stakes, like you kind of mentioned, like Resident Evil or just like horror games in general. I like that fear. Like I think there is obviously there's a chance of like death in RPGs or turn-based RPGs, but oftentimes you can run from the battle, and sure, you can run away in something like Resident Evil or Amnesia, but like there's just a lot more stakes that I really personally love. I like that anxiety. Well, I don't like anxiety, but in horror games, I think it gets a slight pass. So I really enjoy the way that those games make me feel, I guess.
Yeah.
And
the way that they can use like the environment as like a part of combat or part of the encounter, right?
Yeah.
Like you have, the very first Resident Evil, like you're walking down that hallway and those dogs jump out. And then all of it, like not only does it like, give you a heart attack, but then you have to deal with these dogs and you don't have many supplies. Or that first zombie you encounter, you walk around a corner and that the isometric like fixed camera angle. Not isometric, but the fixed camera angle. Like you walk around the corner and there's a zombie there, and then like you try to back up, but you get disoriented. You like that's so intentional, right? Or they put you in a situation not long after that where you've just walked up some stairs and then there's a zombie coming, but there's stairs behind you. There's a thin railing, and so like that environment design can feed into that anxiety that you're talking about, where you don't have options. It's not a God of War
where you can just wail
where
on
you can
them.
just run around and you just you're in a wrestling ring. It's like like it's a very not like a place that's very not conducive to combat, and that makes it more tense, and that like changes the way that each encounter against an enemy can feel, even if it's the exact same enemy. Like it's not like Resident Evil has a lot of enemy like variants, right? Variety, but the way that you encounter them changes the tactics you have to use, the items you have to use, and also their strengths and weaknesses change based on that.
I think too, like speaking of that, you don't see that intentionality done in many Japanese RPGs in general. I think CRPGs, you probably would see a little bit more intentionality in encounters, but not necessarily. And I think that's where a part of that disappointment comes when we talk about how we encounter encounters, because you just basically know I'm getting a line of monsters. They might be grouped in a certain way, and that's why action games or survival horrors are so much more exciting. For me, I think one of the only ones that kind of breaks that genre, and this is a game that I'm probably gonna kill a bunch of Breath of Fire fanboys for saying, but like I love Breath of Fire Dragon's Quarter so much because of how much it broke the mold. And that game like mixes so many good elements, and it's one of the few times where I'm like, when you get into an encounter, the design is super intentional. Like monsters might be grouped together so you can throw a bomb, or you might want to get a monster across a room so that way you can set up so Ryu can tank and the other two can like set traps or whatever. There's a lot of intentional design to it versus I walked across a screen and I got hit with an encounter, and now we're transitioning to this map that really doesn't mean anything at all. So like there are huge differences, and it is, like you said, Casey, apple and oranges, but it makes encounters so much more exciting in non-RPGs than it does in RPGs.
I think the like flip side to all of this too is like strategy games where you have control.
The whole thing is the
right?
encounter,
like like you have Final Fantasy Tactics or you have Fire Emblem, and it's like there's story chunks and then there's combat, and you essentially choose when you go into combat, right? You choose how much time you spend prepping, you choose how to lay out your characters at the beginning of combat, and it's like it's all about player choice, and it's the opposite sort of what we're describing about like some of these survival horror games or action games where like Dark Souls or Elden Ring is intentionally trying to catch you off foot when you're not ready, whereas like you flip it into the player's hands and they're as ready as they can be, but you as a designer can also throw everything at them, and you can change like they might have crafted the perfect team to beat the last stage, but now they think they're ready for the next one. They think they're ready for the executioner's yard, and they're just not, right? And so then the drawing board is like, oh, okay, like I just got like destroyed. Now how do I prepare for that, and how do I know when I'm ready to actually like do that encounter again? What changes do I need to make along the way?
Well, let's actually talk about now. Let's shift the conversation a little bit to instead of like how we hit encounters, how they're set up, because I think we've kind of touched on it a little bit. I think naturally this is where the conversation boils to. What do you think goes into a designer's head when we talk about balancing encounter difficulty in RPGs?
I mean, blah blah blah. What do I mean? It's weird, right? I think it's kind of the crux to like what makes a game a fun, enjoyable, good, or liked game. Like how you balance it, because a game can be ruined, if the experience is different. What we're talking about, if you come at it from a different angle that wasn't intended, it can be not as fun. I think that you tend to see these problems with like older games where like the difficulty was based in there's a line of monsters you have to beat. Yeah, numbers.
Like more monsters, more monsters.
Right,
more numbers,
right.
Yeah.
Like the gameplay hook is number go up, and don't get me wrong, I love numbers go up, but like eventually I don't need that anymore.
I think like looking back at sort of the early Japanese RPGs, if we're specifically talking about those, for a long time and sort of still now, you have that town dungeon structure. And I think that was very much like a pacing thing, right? Because they would gate progress behind, story beats, of course, but they would also gate progress behind difficulty, because if you haven't leveled up enough in the previous dungeon and you haven't bought the new gear in the new town, you're just not going to be strong enough, right? And so like it tells you when you're not strong enough, because you go into the next dungeon and you die. You're like, okay, I'm either too low of a level or I need to gear up. And so you have that town dungeon structure. As that has started to like, evolve away from there, you have interesting games like, Octopath Traveler and Octopath Traveler 2 that gate, the whole world is open, right? It's set up like the world looks like, and it's structured like a regular RPG, like, Final Fantasy. There's towns, there's dungeons, there's field areas, but they're gated by difficulty. And so like, you could theoretically go to any place in the game if you could get through it, but you're level 15 and the next area over is a level 36 area, and you're probably just going to get wiped out in combat. And so like using difficulty to kind of gate off areas to tell the player, subtly, this is where you're supposed to be, this is where you're not supposed to be, is a way I think that they were able to decouple from that town dungeon structure of the old school RPGs, and give the player more freedom without also opening up the whole world, right? Like Breath of the Wild's a weird one. It's, it's not a JRPG, but you can go anywhere, right? Everybody's path is different because it scales, quite a bit. And so like, you can go to any corner of Hyrule and explore there in whatever order you want, but that wouldn't really work as well in a Japanese RPG or an RPG that has a stronger sort of narrative.
Well, and they balance difficulty in games, in open world games like that too, by letting you carry unlimited resources. So that way it's kind of like,
how much fish is in your pocket?
You have these monsters that can hit you for like X damage, but you also can eat 1,000 apples and recover it. So like there are so many ways that open world games have to navigate how they're gonna balance encounter difficulty, because it is just so open, because like it isn't like that linear progress of I'm going to go from, like you said, this city and power up to this city and power up, because there is no clear direction on how you do that.
There's other games like Suikoden that just like you stop gaining experience essentially once you hit the level.
Love it
like,
so much.
You've
Chrono Cross is the same way, right? Like you beat a boss, you get a star, you level up until you're strong enough for the next area, and then you have stuff like Earthbound, where once you've hit a certain level, you just start auto defeating enemies on the field, right? And so like I do like those ways that games say, okay, you're ready. Like there's no sense in in grinding anymore. Just like push on, you're strong enough.
Is that is good design, because it not only does it like respect your time, but it lets you know we built the game so that you don't need this anymore. Like keep going, because you know that there are people, and Jason did this, it's funny, for Final Fantasy V when we were in college. He had like 4 times speed, and I shit you not, he was in the first cave and got to level 25 in the first cave, just power. And he's like, I don't care about this game, I just want to experience it, because back then we didn't have that opportunity. But like you should, as a designer, you shouldn't need to build a game so it's like that. You should just have that natural flow where if the direction is forward, then help the people get there and they use their skill sets to get through.
One really interesting example of that, in a bad way, I think I brought up Lunar Silver Star Story Complete earlier, and it does the exact opposite. The US version does the exact opposite. That like the game and the narrative and the story is like really bubbly and kind and fun and wants to push you forward. It's like really fast paced. But for the US version, they upped the difficulty tremendously. So it's a really
one of the few times it actually
games.
happened too.
Yeah. And so like the whole like the narrative pace is really wants to push you forward. But the game at every turn is trying to get
dying
you to,
on
like,
these slimes, man. I can't get back.
And like you have to leave you get halfway through a dungeon, then you have to leave to like heal at the end, buy more items. And it's like this grind that's like so antithetical to the story's desire to push you forward. And I feel like that's one area, like I love that game. But I was excited. I got a Saturn last year and an optical disc emulator so I can play the Japanese difficulty with the English text, because that's a game where, like, you know, Vic Ireland and Working Designs, they really wanted you to like fight those battles, even though that's not the vibe of the game at all, right?
I mean, we all make mistakes, even game designers, you know.
It's almost padding, right? Like I feel
totally
like
padding,
you can slap on, you're getting your money's worth by adding this grinding padding to a game. And I personally think that's insulting, and that's where I don't blame a lot of people for feeling like you need to level up to play this game. Like I think it's silly.
It's like, gosh, I feel like at the time, like in the late 90s, it was almost like the pinnacle of RPGs was how many hours did it take to beat it. So like you could just pad it that way. Casey agrees. And like it just feels so weird. Like I don't know why I need to get a 100-hour RPG if the game only takes like 50 hours. That's still pretty damn significant, and like that should be really fun and enjoyable.
The two games that broke that, Aidan, you said one of them was Suikoden, and I think like that's a really good example where like you just never needed to grind in that game. And then Paper Mario is the other one, and Casey and I talked about that in our leveling up episode, where like at some point unless you just need the money to buy a few healing items, encounters become irrelevant, because it's the
you
same
get like
thing
one little star each time.
You get one little star, if that, because eventually you just stop getting it and you can't level up anymore. The game's like, no, you're good level, like you should be able to do it.
You need to leave, sir.
Be on your way.
It's funny because Suikoden and like Suikoden 1 and Paper Mario on the 64 are the two like retro games I have like on the go. Like I mid playthrough of both of those, and they do like, they are snappy and they do respect the player's time, and I think that's intentional. The thing is, like, I've also gone like over the course of writing this book and all these other features I've written, I've gone back and played a bunch of retro JRPGs, and like Japanese RPGs like on the Super Nintendo and NES, they weren't that long. Like
no, they weren't.
Not like, you
Chrono
know, like
Trigger's pretty quick.
Chrono Trigger. I mean, I can beat Chrono Trigger really fast.
Like 20 Super Mario RPG, you can beat it in 20 hours.
Clean playthrough of Chrono Trigger for me is 17 hours. I beat Super Mario RPG in 14. You know, Final Fantasy 6, I did a run through of that a couple of years ago. It was like 30 hours. Like, and that was
that's
like
if you do
everything.
Everything. Yeah,
that was like everything I could do. Like all I had like the only thing I had left to do was like grind up all the magic spells, like all the espers on every character.
And
like,
what does that get you? Nothing.
Absolutely nothing. And so like it really was. So like Suikoden came out and it's really snappy, right? It's 10, 15, maybe 20 hours tops. But I think that was just also the way of the genre at that point. It was really once Final Fantasy 7 hit, Final Fantasy 8, Xenogears, like once
they got
the Square games moved into that 3D, like really heavily like anime inspired realm, that they started really bloating up. And I think part of that is just like, it just also takes longer to navigate through 3D game worlds, right? And that expectation that, you know, those games shipped on 3 discs or 4 discs, and that was always a big selling point, right? Like how big they were. And so like the longer they were, the better was the perception. I was also, you know, you got one game a year, one Japanese RPG a year, and like you had to milk it. So like back then I liked that. I liked, you know, spending 80 hours on Final Fantasy 7, but the last time I played it, it was 45 hours, right? So like, you know, the way you approach it also changes, I think, as you get older. But now every game is like 120 hours.
Looking at your Persona 5,
Elden Ring, Persona 5,
Persona 5,
right?
I pounded through Tears of the Kingdom. I'm done, and like once I hit the second shrine, temple, whatever, I was like, I think I've seen all I need to see, so I'm just gonna like go through the rest of the game,
run through it.
And it still took me 74 hours to beat it.
Well, I was like, I was playing the other day. I was like, you know, I've got like 50 shrines. I was like, I feel like this game's quicker than Breath of the Wild. Like, you know, I think, you know, I'm moving through it pretty fast. And then I went and looked at my playtime. It was like 45 hours. And I was like, how? Like,
Well, damn. Yeah.
I was like, I thought I had 15 hours and 50 shrines, but yeah, it's a big one. But all games are like that. Like it feels like every game, you know, Octopath Traveler 2 is like 80 hours. It feels like every game I have to set aside like huge chunks of time, and I don't have time to do that. It's hard.
So to wrap up this conversation on encounters, what I want to do is I want to fix a couple of games or series if this is good for you guys. And Casey, I think I want to start with you so you can get first pick. If you had to fix any of these RPGs to make the experience a little bit more meaningful or enjoyable, what would you do? Which one? What would you fix?
My inclination, and this is not going to be a surprise, I would really love someone to redo it. And I know we had the remake of 7, but I would love like a turn-based, like fix Final Fantasy 7, keep it turn-based. I don't think it's super, I wouldn't say broken. I just think there could be more intent and meaning behind it. I'm not sure that I have an exact answer as to what that should be, because I do think remake did a good job, but I know a lot of fans, myself included, were kind of hoping for a more turn-based experience, and maybe we'll see that in Final Fantasy 9 remaster, remake, whatever the heck they're doing over there at Square with that. But that's that.
I almost feel like they did a good job balancing encounters at the very least for 7 remake, where like you're not often seeing the same monster pattern over and over and over. Like at the very least, you are seeing like this monster and this guy and whatnot, but that's kind of getting in that God of War-ish, like we were talking about, setup as opposed to regular RPG.
And I do love
you're right. I think you're right though.
I do love remake. I think it's incredible. I just that part of me is just like, I just kind of wish it stuck with turn-based. Let us stand in front of each other and take turns hitting each other with our weapons.
There is that weird Final Fantasy 7 remake that's still turn-based. What is it called? Remember, it's like still, oh gosh. It incorporates like, for what is it called?
Is it out yet?
And it incorporates like
Ever Crisis?
Ever Crisis? Is that what it's called?
It's gonna. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I don't think it's out yet, but
no, it's not.
But yeah, I think it's gonna. It could be that. It's very like chibi little animated.
Yeah, it's still chibi. It still uses turn based.
Oh,
and it has like,
is that kind of the same thing they did for Final Fantasy 15?
Yeah, with like the
pocket edition.
Yeah.
Weird.
All right, who's next? What other games are we fixing, or how are we fixing them?
I'll go next. I've got an idea. So like one of the things I really like, as I said earlier, is just like narrative heavy JRPGs, but I often get bogged down if combat adds too much time. And so I dropped off Trails in the Sky FC on the PSP 10 years ago because, you know, I love the story, I love the world, I love the quests, but the combat was just so slow in that game. The Vita version, the PC version, give fast forward, which is great. I've been playing Suikoden. It's got fast combat, but I just really want the story, right? Suikoden 2 as well. Those are like really narrative heavy games, and one of the like most unique narrative heavy Japanese RPGs that I can think of was Radiant Historia, which went and the DS version was cool, but then they re-released on 3DS and gave you a mode that basically removed combat from the game.
Yeah, no combat.
And some people love the combat in the game. I didn't like it. I felt like it took too much time.
It's
I
tedious.
felt like it's super tedious.
Yeah.
Every combat encounter was the same. You went through the same steps. There was a most efficient way to beat the battle through the moves you had, and you just did it over and over and over again.
Move everything together and then hit everything all at the same time.
Yes, exactly. And so like they knew that, and they removed combat, and you only fought boss battles, and then turned it into basically like a visual novel. And I thought it was great. And I feel like you could improve a lot of games by allowing people like, you know, something like Trails in the Sky, take it from being a 40-hour RPG to being like a, you know, 25-30 hour, like basically a visual novel, and you have those big emotional like showdowns, boss battles, because those are important in those games, but get rid of all that like fighting the same enemies over and over and over again in combat that like takes too long, even with fast forward. And so you know, like I'd love to see that system that Radiant Historia implemented in its remaster brought into something like the Trails in the Sky, Trails of Cold Steel series. because combat, like, they aped and they took a lot from Grandia, which is great. Like, it's a good, if you're going to steal from any combat system, steal from Grandia, but
Yeah,
it's still just, it felt like I don't really get why I'm doing so much fighting in those games. Like, it doesn't, like, I get that you're bracers, but like, why am I fighting snakes all the time, right? And so, like, I think narratively you could lose a lot of combat in those games and it would still feel appropriate. So that's what I would do. I would add a visual novel mode to Trails in the Sky.
Visual novel flair is interesting. I never really thought about that, but I have to like reevaluate what I've played to see like what would I visual novelify.
Yeah. It wouldn't work for everything. Like,
no,
there's lots of games that it wouldn't work for at all, but I think Trails in the Sky would be a good one.
Patrick, you want to round us out here?
Yeah, so Dragon Quest, because we see the same monsters over and over and over again, and like I love them, and that is one of my favorite series, but I think what I would do is reduce like 90% of the encounters and then make most of your encounters mini bosses and bosses.
Yeah. That was kind of like the second half of 11 was kind of like that, and it was cool.
Oh yeah, kind of. I still feel like they didn't have enough of a...
The third half. The final
yeah. Because you really don't have to. You really don't have to fight much in the third half of the game, or third.
Because you've killed everything twice at that point.
I almost said third quarter, but there's only two parts. The third part.
It was cool. Though. It did work well.
Third trimester of Dragon Quest. But I would do that just because, like, I love seeing these iconic monsters, but like we see them a lot and we see different variations of them. So I think in Dragon Quest in general, one of the things that I get most excited about on the flip side of encounters is boss battles. And because I think it is that true test of skill and what you've built. In fact, there's I can't think of the name of it, but I played on PlayStation. It's basically an indie Dark Souls, but you only fight the bosses. You don't fight anything. It might be called Eldest Souls, maybe. You don't fight anything else. So there's no grind. Like you get your skill point from beating the boss, and you get possibly any weapon, and then you just kind of move on and you can do them in any order. And I would want to see something like that in some of these games that are our high frequency encounter games, because I do think, like, especially for how long Dragon Quest 11 is, and assuming 12 is probably going to be like that too, find some better ways to engage my time. Now, that's being said, I love the series and I will still play it, but it would be cool to see them, like, not necessarily change it overall, but shift that focus of, hey, we have some people that play games now and don't have 110 hours of combat to invest.
No, my mind is just thinking now, if that, like, what we call it, Dragon Quest Souls, like a Dragon Quest game but Souls style. That sounds amazing. Like, kind of running around that world. That's the game that would get direction. Yeah, that would get me into Souls. That's what I would do.
More Dragon Quest content.
Yeah, in general. Just Dragon Quest in general. Period is also great.
Hell yeah.
Okay, that was a long and in-depth conversation about encounters. It was amazing, though. I appreciate it. It's super cool. Hope you all enjoyed listening to it as well, and you were all reminiscing about your favorite encounters too. We are going to take another quick break. I also need to refill my water, so give me a hot minute. But we want to hear your thoughts. Tell us what you think over on Twitter and Instagram. We are at RPGaymer. And then we also have our Discord too. It is chatting up as we are recording this right now. People are talking about games. It's an amazing thing. And we will be right back.
And we're back for part 2 of our podcast. And as usual, we play a little game with our guest. And following up with our episode with David Vink, which was our previous episode, we thought it'd be really funny to do another Would You Rather because it went so well with him. His Would You Rather was all Super Nintendo focused. Ours is going to be just revolving around funny encounters. for the sake of time for this episode, this time, instead of all of us chiming in about what we would do, I think what we're going to do, since there are 4 of us, is we're just going to target someone specifically and ask them, would you rather blah or blah? So, Casey, since you have talked the least on this podcast, you,
as per
friend,
usual.
are going to
Wow, calling him out.
No, just my MO. It's cool. All right.
Your HOMO.
Yes, exactly. All right. We'll start with you, Patrick. Patrick.
Okay.
All right. Would you rather suplex a train in Final Fantasy VI or suplex the Demon's Gate from the Temple of the Ancients?
Ooh.
As I remember suplexing the Demon's Gate monster as Tifa, and I thought that was like the most ridiculous thing in the world.
I think suplexing a train is so much cooler, to the point where I've literally seen
it's
like
a meme.
web comics, like the meme comics of it, because it's like so insane to think about. And I just played a hack version of Final Fantasy VI called Brave New World.
Oh, I remember you
and
telling us
when
about
when you do it, if you suplex a train, there's no achievements for the game, but a little message just pops up saying achievement unlocked, suplex a train, which I thought was really cute.
That's fantastic.
So absolutely would suplex that train.
Hell yeah.
Okay, I will go next. Jason,
God, here it comes.
would you rather fight 100 Rattata-sized Snorlaxes or 1 Snorlax-sized Rattata?
I mean, just the sheer lunacy and fun of seeing 100 small-sized Snorlaxes seems kind of amazing.
Very small.
Are they gonna run and just like sleep on me like a cat would? That seems kind of ideal.
You're,
to be honest.
you're fighting them. So
okay. Logistically thinking, logically thinking, if they also weigh as much as like a Snorlax, that could be tough. But I'm still gonna pick 100 little tiny Snorlaxes barreling towards me. I don't know. Honestly, the picture of that now sounds idealistic. It sounds like what I would want to do.
Like lay on top of them, take a nap.
Yeah, isn't Snorlax's only thing that it's big and in the way?
It's
like,
sleepy.
Yeah, it's getting in the way.
Any other tactics?
So just like,
And I need to cut things away.
I was going to do it with blue slimes, but I was like, wait, but 100 blue slimes is just a king slime.
That's a king slime.
Yeah, king slime. There you go. There you go.
So, Casey, would you rather see a monster coming, or would you rather have one randomly jump out at you from the dark if you're dungeon crawling? Random encounters? Or
define coming.
enemy in the field.
Don't listen to him.
Patrick and his dirty mind. I would rather see it coming. If I'm like imagining me as Casey and not like as an avatar in a video game, because I am a scaredy cat little bitch.
Oh my gosh.
I would rather see it coming 112%.
I literally thought that you were going the dirty route. You paused so emphatically when you said coming. And I was like, oh no.
Awesome. You have Patrick humor.
Why would that be the thing he would say? I don't.
We don't know Aidan that well.
Welcome to
maybe
RPGaymer.
he has dirty humor like Patrick.
Okay, Aidan. I feel like this is an easy one, but it's going to give me a sense of what type of person you are. Would you rather be able to transform into a dragon like Ryu from Breath of Fire, or would you rather have the power to transform into one of those little one-up mushrooms from Super Mario RPG?
Oh gosh, are we talking Dragon Quarter? Because that doesn't go good if Ryu transforms into a dragon very often.
Good point. How about Breath of Fire 3 specifically?
Okay, yes, 3 transform into a dragon for sure, and then like confuse myself by trying to fuse with other dragons endlessly.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I like eating mushrooms. I don't want to be eaten as a mushroom.
Oh, see, I was thinking you would be safe in like mushroom form, but I didn't think about being eaten. I guess that's true.
Yeah, that's what.
You just kind of sit there.
Did you not watch the Mario movie?
You get stuck in a box, a golden box.
Yeah,
with
right.
Just waiting. Just
need to get hit out by somebody.
What a sad existence.
So, Casey.
Yes, sir.
Would you rather fight all of the Silent Hill bosses back to back?
From just the first game? Or the whole...
All of the Silent Hill bosses back to back? Or all of the Resident Evil bosses back to back?
Wow, why do you gotta be like that?
Oh, that's so good.
Back to back.
Silent Hill is going to be a little bit more mind fucky. So I feel like that would like really mess with my brain. I mean,
There are fewer of them though.
True. Am I me? Or am I?
Yes,
you are Casey.
You are Casey.
I am Casey. Maybe I will go Silent Hill because there's always, I mean, not half. That's me assuming, but I feel like sometimes like it's not real. It's just in your head. So maybe we'll go that route because Resident Evil, those things exist. Silent Hill, it's a little more in your brain.
Casey is metagaming the game.
Yeah, I mean,
he's him, so he's allowed to.
Yeah, so maybe I would go the Silent Hill route. All right. I mean, this is a question that you don't have to include. Jason, I forget. Are you a big Resident Evil person?
Yeah, I played them. I played a lot of them.
Okay, I thought so. Okay, Jason. Okay, would you rather have to punch your way through a boulder, a la Chris Redfield, but you are Jason, or would you rather have to to fight Nemesis in the police station?
Oh shit. I just think out of I don't know. It would be really cool to be like, I'm Jason, the guy that literally punched through the boulder. But I know I have very weak hands. But can I like prep? Do I know the boulder is coming?
Sure. Yeah. I still don't know that'll help you, but sure.
Okay, not
so you're
the
gonna
gross
random
boulder.
encounter a boulder? What are you asking?
That's what I'm thinking. Like, do I walk and the boulder is just there, or do I know like eventually I'm gonna have to approach this boulder? Okay. I think I would still punch through the boulder because it sounds kind of amazing, and then I would get through my real life gains of being like, I want to be more fit. So this seems like a great win-win.
You'll probably get in like the Guinness Book of World Records for that or some shit.
Just slap on that world record and that's just icing on the cake.
Put in your Instagram.
Yeah, the bloody snuggles indeed.
Most bones shattered in a hand.
Right, exactly.
In one punching.
Patrick, I got one for you. Okay. Okay, this one is a little complicated. Okay, Patrick, I have one for you. Are you ready?
Yes.
You're not ready. Would you rather have your mind...
Final Fantasy VI.
No, I had to prep him earlier. That's why he knows. Would you rather have your mind wiped completely clean of having played Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy IV or Final Fantasy VI, knowing that you can play them all again very fresh, but you can only choose one of them to replay, and the rest you will never experience at all in your entire life?
Jesus.
Aidan's probably not going to like this very much, but I would be completely okay with Final Fantasy VI being the one that I replay.
So you pick 6, and then in Patrick's world, he will never see, hear, experience, or watch 4 or Chrono Trigger.
Correct. I feel like I don't think I would be able to live without 6 because of how much it's defined my life. Now, that's not saying that, like, I do think 6 or Chrono Trigger is the better game, but, like, 6 has really defined my life and my gaming.
That's
so
fair.
like I don't think I don't think I could. And Final Fantasy 4 made me
didn't
cry.
Pick 4.
Yeah, no. 4. My parents divorced when 4 was out, and there was a whole Edge scene with the parents dying, and I remember crying on the couch. My brother was playing, and he's like, "Why are you sobbing, bitch?" And I'm like in a 3rd grade,
Shut up,
crying on the couch. So yeah, 4 can go.
Okay. I was like, I don't know if you pick 6 or Chrono Trigger. So okay,
cool. A long time ago, we had a podcast about video game weapons, and that's obviously
that was your first episode, right?
Maybe I don't really remember, but obviously that's like a big part of encounters. So would you rather fight a horde of monsters, your choice, but they have to be like difficult, and you don't have to like give me an answer, but like something hard, not like blue slimes, with either would you rather have a giant frozen tuna as your weapon or a giant cheese grater?
A cheese grater.
It's from Yakuza Like a Dragon.
The tuna would thaw. Yeah, the tuna would thaw.
Would it?
Right?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
It's a magical tuna that will always be frozen.
Magical frozen.
It's like in Shadow Hearts or whichever.
I'm not strong enough to pick up a frozen tuna.
That's fair.
I've seen some nasty YouTube videos with.
You drew the stop was like, oh, no matter 100 slimes coming at me, but that tuna's gonna thaw out.
It'll thaw out before I even 100 slimes, let alone.
But if you were fighting the 100 slimes, I bet you wish you had the tuna because the cheese grater is probably not going to work.
Oh yeah, they're kind of liquidy.
Oh man,
yeah, it would just go right
on
through
Jello.
But I mean, like,
think of cheese grating Jello.
It's like magical Jello.
Like reforms.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm screwed either way, aren't I?
Yeah, that's the real
Damn
answer.
you, blue slime.
Cheese grater. I saw too many horrifying cheese grater stories in my wayward youthful days on the internet. So got to go with the cheese grater.
Good choice.
You guys trying to sway me. Okay, Patrick.
Yes.
You are in the most regrettable sequel of all time.
Jason's in it, isn't he?
What?
No,
Probably.
Thanks.
The most regrettable sequel of all time. You're going into an encounter. Are you going to choose? Do you want experience or do you want gold? Can't have both. Got to choose.
This is a terrible sequel game.
Yeah.
I am 100% okay with there being no experience in a game.
Oh,
Really?
Level
man.
one
Okay.
run.
Yeah, those are doable. There's a lot of like you watch a lot of playthroughs of games which is like 0 levels. A lot of Bravely Default videos on how to do that.
I can see that. I can see that.
I don't think I enjoy equipment a lot in games too.
Yeah.
So that'd be hard. Yeah. But that's
taking the
definitely
gold. Taking the gold.
Yeah.
Do you guys, any of you guys know the context for that?
No.
Lunar Dragon Song on the
That's a
Nintendo DS
terrible game.
is a third Lunar. It's a sequel.
I
It's
had
so
it.
bad. Yeah, so
It's so
bad.
It's so bad.
Oh,
that's right. You had to pick.
choose.
You had to pick.
You could get gold or you could get
Like each
experience.
battle, or like
Each battle.
Okay.
Yeah. I think you could
Yeah.
toggle on the bottom. It was on DS, so I think you could toggle from battle to battle. But yeah, you
Weird.
couldn't get both. You could either grind for gold or you could grind for experience. So like I wanted to bring it up earlier when we were talking about like bloat in games, and that was the
That's
worst.
so silly.
Yeah. That was a game too that like even back then had like a speed up, like animation speed up toggle, and it's like
Like
guys,
they knew it was bad.
If you know you have to put in a speed up toggle,
Yeah.
like, and you're gonna make me fight double the battles, like just make them faster and let me get
Yeah.
experience in gold. Anyway,
But on the
gold,
flip
good
side, it's
choice.
also the game that if you are running on the
Yes,
map, it damages you. Like I don't remember we
Oh, I
talked about
remember
the
you
one
telling me
episode,
about
but
that.
yes.
yeah, but you like when you
lose
run,
HP. Yeah.
you lose HP. So
Yeah,
yeah, there's
yeah.
just the
Yeah,
poor design game.
Anybody studying game design, you got to play that. Just do
No,
everything the opposite. Like
Speaking of
innovate
games
for
to
the
wipe
sake of
memory,
innovation.
that would be the one that I would.
That's the one you want to play. Yeah,
Yeah,
just get
yeah.
rid of that one.
Ooh.
It
That's
can,
one
it
of
can
the
go
first
die.
games I've ever played, and I've been like, "This is a bad game,"
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
never wanted to play it again.
Did you beat it?
Yeah, it's awful.
No, I did not beat it.
I
Good.
beat it.
Oh,
I sold
so
it.
sorry.
Yeah, I don't know why.
Mhm.
I love Lunar. I love Lunar too.
I know. I love Lunar as well. Like, it's a good series, but not that game. Is not the one.
Okay, Casey, you ready for
yes,
this?
sir.
Bum, 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 bum. Okay. Would you rather play an all white mage run in the original NES version of Final Fantasy, or just play
It'll
through
never
the,
work.
or just play through the regular game of Mystic Quest?
I feel bad saying this. I don't really know a lot about Mystic Quest, so I'm gonna go with that because I love a surprise sometimes, and give me a surprise.
It has awesome music.
I
That's
do,
amazing.
I
music.
do
The
like
music
that.
is really good.
It
I know
also-
it exists, but I really know
Yeah.
very little about any of it.
It's got like basic puzzle solving in the
Mhm.
dungeons. It's not bad.
It's not as
It's
bad
not
as
bad.
Lunar Dragon Song.
It's
Yeah.
far better than Lunar Dragon Song.
Is it better than
Is
Quest
it better
64?
or worse? Oh, okay. Well, nothing is actually better than the pinnacle of all games.
Your
so how
favorite.
dare you compare it to Quest 64? So
I had to bring
no,
it up.
It is much better than Quest 64.
Good to know.
It's like it's a
Honestly,
game.
it's a-
Like
yeah.
it's a game. Like
It's
it's not a
it's a
it's not a
game.
great game. It's not a
Yeah.
bad game. It's
It's
just a
fine.
game. Yeah. All right. I will wrap this up with Aidan. I have a question for you. And this one I wrote specifically for you, not even knowing that we were doing this, but
Okay.
this one, my dude. Would you rather fight Lavos from Chrono Trigger with a full party with all starting equipment, or with just one character?
Oh well,
Any-
I've beat Lavos lots with just Chrono, so I'm going with that one.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh.
What a
Oh, so
flex.
what you
That
were
was a
saying
big
is
flex,
what I
yeah.
heard is you are not man enough to do it
No.
with all starting
No.
equipment, which would have been the real flex.
Wow. Patrick, we wanted to come back. Don't be mean.
I don't know. I think that would be just as easy, honestly, in Chrono Trigger.
Probably.
Magic's so strong. Like
It
you
is.
don't rely on
Mhm.
equipment that much in that game. So
Lumina,
like,
Lumina.
yeah, exactly. You just blast flare and stuff. Like I think you'd be fine.
He doesn't even need a sword. He could just use his
No.
hair.
A mop.
Yeah, there you go.
You can use a
Or
mop.
mop.
I'll
You can use a-
take down Lavos with a mop.
There you go. All right. Well, Aidan, this was a great episode. That was a
Thank
fun
you so
game.
much for coming.
This was a super good time.
Yeah.
Want to give yourself an opportunity to let our listeners know where they can find you
Yeah.
and your content, and where they can also pick up your book.
Yeah, so I'm out and about on the internet, as we all are. I'm regrettably still on Twitter at a dribble of ink, which is ADRIBBLEOFINK, like a dribble of ink on a piece of paper. And you can find me at my website, which is my name, aidanmoher.com. I have a newsletter called Astrolabe, which is about everything geeky. It's about, video games, it's about movies, it's about books, it's about science fiction and fantasy, it's about writing, it's about a little bit of everything. I do interviews there, I do features, I do each issue, so it's an issue-based newsletter, and each issue I go back and I play an old retro game and kind of give thoughts on that, a little review, recommend books, stuff like that. That's called Astrolabe. And my book is available anywhere books are sold. So you can get it at your, favorite mega online retailer, if you have one of those. But you can also, and what I like to recommend is go to your local bookshop in your town. And if they don't have it on the shelf, they can order it in as well.
Yeah, I found it at a local game shop, which was really cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that, because there's such great crossover with those audiences, and a few people have told me they got it at like a game shop or a comic shop, which is awesome. So
I bought a copy too, and it was also at our local library. I was yeah, they have it here.
Fantastic. They don't have it at my local library, which forever saddens me. But I have too much of an ego to like recommend or like request it myself.
Drop it off.
I feel like you earned that right. If you have a book published, you definitely earned that right.
I should get my mom to do it. She'll do it in a second. But yeah, you can get it anywhere books are sold. It's called Fight Magic Items: The History of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the Rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. I have another book that I just finished writing the first draft of. It's going to my editor soon. It will appeal to anyone who likes Japanese RPGs, the history of Japanese RPGs, and my first book as well. I can't talk about it yet. It will be announced soon, maybe before this episode comes out. I'm not sure. But yeah, keep an eye on my Twitter, my newsletter, my website, and you'll hear about it right away as soon as I can talk about it.
Well, again, thank you so much for being here. Like, again, we would love to have you back on in the future.
Yeah, this has been so much fun. It's so good to talk to people like about this stuff I don't always get to in real life. We get
to nerd out together.
And so
anytime
talking about games with people who love games as much or more than I do it's the best. This is awesome.
It certainly was awesome. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. And I'll reiterate one more time to our fans and listeners listening. We want to hear your thoughts too. Tell us your favorite encounters, your least favorite encounters. What are your fun thoughts on our game that we played too? Twitter and Instagram at RPGaymer. We'll respond to you there. And then also on Discord. We always love hearing your thoughts. And a special shout out to all of our patrons. They get their questions answered here too. We have a special Patreon channel for them to talk about games just with those special patrons, and you can support us there, patreon.com/RPGaymer. Anything we do there, all that support, we really, really do appreciate, and we love all of the love and support you give us.
If you enjoyed listening to us today, be on the lookout for our next podcast, the Castlevania series. Coming up in 2 weeks. We appreciate you all for listening and hope you had a great time. Now go out there and get gaming.